Hello, my name is Marvin Oxenham, and in this video we will be looking at the practice of character and virtue education, and in particular to give you some practical tools to implement character and virtue education in a theological school. The division of this session will be as follows. We will first look at how character and virtue can be sought. Then we will look at how character and virtue can be caught. Then we will consider how character and virtue can be taught. And finally, we will consider some of the challenges and possibly some of the objections, practically speaking, to character and virtue education. So, as you can see, we have three nice words that rhyme together. We have sought, caught, and taught. And that will sort of be the framework, the structure of how we will try to look at some of the practices of character and virtue education. So, first of all, how can character and virtue be sought? What we are looking at here is about what can be done structurally in a theological school or in a formal or even a non-formal theological training initiative to support the formation, the education of character and virtue. And this is very important. It may seem, again, theoretical, but it is not. This is very practical, because just as a plant, and you see in the image here, I have a plant in a hothouse. Just as a plant needs the right climate to grow, so the soul requires the right environment to flourish. And so a theological school needs to be structured in a way that will actually support the education of character and virtue. Now, most of our schools are not intentionally structured to support the education of character and virtue. They are structured to support academic endeavor. The classrooms, the libraries, the schedules, everything in the way our schools are structured is very much geared toward supporting academic excellence, and that is a good thing. But if we also want to be intentional and to do things to support character and virtue education, we need to think about how we might implement some changes in terms of structure. Now, this clearly involves the leadership of the school, the board, the stakeholders, to think deeply about how schools are structured. So this may not be just a fresh hand of paint here or there. There may be some rather deep and challenging issues ahead for schools that want to engage intentionally with character and virtue education. So, first of all, a first element in implementing structural support, so the sought element, is strategic planning. And here, the vision and mission statements, the core values, and the curriculum aims need to be explicit and intentional and connected to character and virtue education. So your vision statement of your school, does the bold vision, the bold dream of your theological school or initiative, again, I am speaking both to the formal and to the non-formal, I want to keep both of those in mind. Does the vision statement specifically include the education of character and virtue? Is it there? And if not, how might it be? The mission statement, does your plan spell out clearly, for example, that you develop a training program and a learning community meant to develop virtuous character? Is that specifically stated somewhere in your mission statement? The core values, what is important to your school or your training initiative? So for example, core values such as, we believe that every human flourishes in being virtuous. Or, we believe that character can be intentionally shaped in adults. Because some would say this is just for children. Or we believe in the special power of grace to become women and men of virtuous character. So these are core values. Or you could also express core values with short sentences such as virtues, the purpose of human life, or character, the essence of discipleship, or theology, transforming who you are. And these are almost like mottos that you put on your a bumper sticker on your website, but sometimes they can be very, very significant in shaping and giving the identity to the theological school or training initiative. And curricular aims also, what are the aims of the curriculum? What are the learning outcomes? What are the growing outcomes? What are the yearly objectives? And then what are the action plans to actually flesh out the objectives? Now, I won't get into a course here on strategic planning, but you should know these things. And here I'm just suggesting that these need to be intentionally applied in the structures of a theological school or training initiative to be able to support character and virtue. But secondly, there's also organizational aspects involved. If you have a truck, that is no good if your vision is to cross the ocean. Yeah, you need the right kind of organization to meet certain kinds of objectives. So, for example, your facilities, your library, and even the selection of books that are in your library, the furniture in your classrooms. Are your classrooms, is the furniture all with a blackboard or a PowerPoint projector that is pointing to the front to a lectern, and all seats that are seated with desks to be able to write on? There is a hidden curriculum in the way that our classrooms are designed. That particular design is saying something about the kind of learning that will take place in that environment. So we need to think about the organization, the facilities, the libraries, but even things like the yearly calendar. How do you divide your semesters and your weeks and your days and the deadlines and the assessment deadlines and the semester timetables? These may be very suitable for certain objectives, but are they suitable for community growth in character and virtue? We need to think about that. I'm not saying they're not, but we need to think about that. The budget needs to be aligned. Where does the budget speak to the objective of developing character and virtue? The evaluation, the quality assurance processes, we'll talk about that a little later on. Do they also fit together with the vision of character and virtue? The composition of the staff. So, for example, is there a person on staff whose main job is to monitor and enhance the quality of character and virtue education in the school? That would be a fantastic job to give to somebody. That's their main job. Yeah. Or extracurricular activities. And here, may I just say that sometimes the temptation is to put character education together with spiritual formation into the extracurricular. And some of it can happen there. I will argue in my next point that we also need to bring it into the curriculum. But in the extracurricular, many good things can be done to cultivate character and virtue. But even using art, using symbols. I visited this fantastic museum in southern Italy, in Naples, and there was actually a charity that was put together in the Middle Ages by noble families of Naples, and their purpose was to put into practice the 7 works of mercy. So 7 virtues of mercy, of feeding the hungry, burying the dead, and the 7 works of mercy. And they actually, in the museum, there's this beautiful wood table, and it has 7 places at the table, and each place is carved into the wood an image of one of the 7 works of mercy. And the 7 noble families that ran this charity, every year they would rotate around the table and be the chairs, as it were, of a different one of the works of mercy. And they would actually sit at the table where the carving was of that particular work of mercy. So a very powerful use of art, even in reinforcing the culture and the structural support around the objectives of developing character and virtue. The venue, and if I could say for art, even music, how many songs do we have about virtue? How many hymns do we have about character to encourage each other in developing virtues? So if there are musicians listening to this particular video, would you please write some songs for us about character and virtue? We really would need to sing those. The venue. In my book, I've explored different models. So I've talked about the cloud model, the retreat center model, the embedded city model, the local community model, the residential campus model. There are different ways, different kinds of campuses, different venues that are possible in different kinds of theological education. So character education can be done in many ways. But what I want to say here is that we need to be intentional, and we need to plan and align what we're seeking to do with the venues that we have and how we will use them to do it. So again, if you have a truck, you should drive it, not try to fly it. So the structural support and aligning them with our strategic planning. So that's the first point. How can character and virtue be sought? Second point, how can character and virtue be caught? And here we are looking about shaping communities of character. And this is a fantastic vision, and one which certainly finds us as theological educators well aligned and enthusiastic about the concept of community. But maybe we can think further about the concept of community and of the importance of that in shaping character and shaping virtue. Now, some cultures may be more individualistic and will struggle with community. Other cultures are very much naturally communitarian, and so therefore for them the community aspect of theological education is just a natural expression of their own cultures. Theological education has a natural affinity for education in community, and we have the examples of the life of Israel, the life of the church, and the ecclesia, and so forth. But much can also be learned from the literature on character education that actually sees community as one of the principal forces in shaping virtuous character. So for example, Aristotle, who is perhaps one of the classical philosophers who's written most about character and virtue, he believed that Athens, as the capital of Greece, did not have educational programs. Athens was the educational program. He actually believed that the city of Athens, the community of the city of Athens, was the most powerful aspect in shaping the character of young Athenians. And therefore, the community, the city of Athens, needed to be shaped in a certain way to then have an impact on the lives of the citizens. No amount of organization, regulation, or curricular innovation will substitute a virtuous learning community. That is the main shaping force on students. It is the nature of the community, and we need to work on shaping and safeguarding that community according to virtue. Remember, virtue will breed virtue. And if you get that right, most of the educational task is mostly done. So here are some ideas of what we can be thinking about as we shape intentional communities of character. So let's think about staff and faculty. What do we mean when we say we have a good team? Now, yes, we have a team that is effective, that is well trained, that has academic qualifications in the faculty, that has professional skills in the administration. They have published books, they have degrees, they have experience. These are all very good things. And even in our hiring process, what are the things we are looking for? Well, we're usually looking at the curriculum of experiences, of competences, of degrees, of academic publication records, and so forth. But where does character and virtue fit in? Where do we look at the character of our faculty? Where do we look at the virtues that are in the administration offices or in the leadership of the school? When was the last time at a job interview that character and virtue were being looked at as the most important things beyond maybe a stellar publication record of a faculty, potential new faculty member? So, and even ongoing character and virtue. I mean, virtue is not a status. Virtue is a process. And being part of a team in theological education should entail ongoing experience of growth, accountability, renewal around character and virtue, even within the team of the staff and faculties. So the team, and again, I'm speaking about the team, not just the faculty, the entire team. They are advocates of character education and able practitioners of character education, but also women and men who embody virtue. Character is caught. It is seen. The principle of mimesis, of imitation of those that are around us, that we see as points of reference, has an incredible impact on the lives of those that are entrusted to us in our educational endeavors. Now, the opposite is also true, because vice can also be very contagious. And if students are brought up in a community where there's envy, where there's jealousy, where there's strife, where there's pride, where there's a lack of spirit of collaboration, where people don't ask forgiveness to each other, they will imitate that as well, and they will bring those poisonous vices into their ministry and into their church. So staff and faculty are very important as we think about that. And sometimes we may need to have the courage to let someone go just because they are toxic in a community and they are not bringing virtue, but rather the opposite. So what about students? Well, the same in students. We should rethink admissions. When students apply to us, we usually look at their educational track record. Do they have secondary education, or if they're studying for a master's program, do they have a bachelor degree, or if they're in a non-formal program, do they have the qualifications necessary for that? And that is important. But in addition to looking at grades and transcripts, can we also look at ways to find whether there's a genuine commitment to grow in character? Now, we don't have to look at students that are perfectly virtuous, or we won't have any. But are they committed to self-assess themselves, to be humble, and actually humility? Cassian wrote that humility is the first virtue that you need before you can have any of the others. Because if you're not humble, you will not develop any of the other virtues. So when we interview students to offer them a place in our programs, are we looking for humility, that ability to, that desire and understanding to want to grow in character? The discipline in a theological enterprise as well. This is much more than just conformity to rules and much more than a policing system in a theological school. Could there be cases where someone is actually asked to leave the community just because they're not committed to virtue? And they're not committed to holding the community together around that particular commitment to be a community of character. And the nature of friendship, what is friendship in a community? Well, friendship, one writer said, friendship is actually the good that binds us together. We are friends as we cultivate virtue together, and much can be said about that. But again, cultivating friendship around a common commitment to that which is good and to that which is virtuous, and that will create deep ties within a community. And so cultures of virtue. We want to explore those cultures of virtues within our communities. So we explore, people of course come first, so staff and faculty and students, but also the symbols, as I mentioned, the art, the practices, the memories that create identities of virtue. So this is part of the intentional work that we're doing within our communities to make them into communities that embody a culture of virtue. Now, clearly here expectations need to be realistic. There are also dangers in community, and I've written about some of these in my book. So it is important as we shape communities of virtue to also keep some of the dangers in mind. We don't want to become cultish. We don't want to become obsessed with continually evaluating people and creating a climate of fear and of judgment. These are things that we do not want to do. That is not a community of character. So we do need to be wise in balancing as we shape these communities. So thirdly, how can character and virtue be taught? So we've looked at sought, we've looked at caught in community, and now we look at sought. And so here we talk about teaching virtue. So first of all, you need a curriculum. There are severe challenges here to the traditional curricula that we are familiar with. I think if I were to describe a typical curriculum, you would probably say that looks pretty much like what our curriculum looks like. An Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, church history, life of Jesus, systematics, and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it can be a captivity to intentionally developing character and virtue, because that curriculum, it already fills the horizon. And character and virtue may have difficulty finding their place within these structured curricula. So this is not about simply adding something else to that traditional curricula. I'm suggesting we may want to be more radical in our rethinking. If you come away from this particular video with the idea, oh, let's add a course on character and virtue to our curriculum, well, then I fear that I've failed. Or perhaps we need to think a little bit more, or perhaps maybe I could give you some more ideas if you go and read more of what I've said in my book. I'm arguing that we need to more radically rethink program aims, outcomes, a new set of courses, and design virtue outcomes in the courses. We need program aims that make character and virtue education clear, intentional, and central. We need new learning, growing outcomes. We need new sets of courses that are structured to achieve these outcomes. In my book, I actually propose a radical curriculum. You need to engage in both virtue-specific courses, but also in virtue-related objectives in all of your courses. And here, in my book, I describe the difference between vertical objectives and horizontal objectives. And so this is a bit of curriculum design material, but you can do both within the curriculum to be able to achieve these particular outcomes. So for example, you may want a specific course on virtue literacy, or on habituation practices, and I'll come to those in a minute. But you may also want to engage them with the virtue of compassion as they study the Gospels and the life of Jesus. Or you may want to engage them in the virtue of friendship as they study the bad examples of 2 Corinthians. So you can think both vertically and horizontally in your curriculum. You need also to understand how a virtue-related course is taught. Now, the greatest danger here is, in teaching a course related to virtue, is that you end up telling students about character and virtue, rather than helping them grow in character and virtue. You don't just give them knowledge. You also help them reason around virtue, and you help them develop virtue practices. So these are sort of the threefold practices around teaching. There's virtue knowledge, virtue reasoning, and virtue practice. And so engaging students with teaching or with educating them in virtue, and maybe we may not want to use the word teaching, because teaching we automatically think of standing up and lecturing. But teaching is much more than that. Teaching is walking with our students. It's helping develop many other things. It's putting them at the center of the learning process. And we'll look at a few tools in a moment. So we're involving different aspects of their lives, their attention, their emotions, their desires, their actions, their expressions. We're looking at these different things intentionally as we lead them in teaching virtue. And so, as we think of this, we need a new set of andragogical tools, and andragogy is simply adult pedagogy. So the tools of teaching and learning. And here are some, and there's more. And again, in my book, there's lists and more richer description of some of these, and you may do your own exploration. The first certainly is habituation. Habituation is one of the most powerful tools, educational tools that has sort of been lost in our own educational tradition, and it is perhaps the most ancient, most effective, most forgotten teaching approach in character and virtue education. And so I'll just leave that as a curiosity with you to go and dig a little bit more into habituation and what that actually is. But that is, I think it is the one most powerful tool that we need to rediscover and put into practice in our educational ventures. But also, new tools like service and project-based learning outside the classroom that is intentionally focused on growth in virtue. So for example, having our students work with the poor and intentionally cultivate the virtue of compassion and the virtue of mercy, or to have them work in advocacy of some sort and intentionally cultivate the virtues of justice and courage. Other approaches include revisiting role modeling, dialogical practices, story-based lecturing, and recent pedagogy is suggesting so many new practices like peer-to-peer tutoring, problem solving, learning by doing, role-playing, brainstorming, flipped classroom, cooperative teaching, mind mapping, and I could go on and on and on. But there are so many rich tools that we can discover beyond the lecture, which is sort of what many of us are stuck with, which is a good tool, but it's one of many. And certainly for developing character and virtue, we need to explore a wide range of tools in our andragogy. So, virtue as sought, caught, and taught. And hopefully that will give you some initial thoughts to reflect on your practice. The challenges. And so we move into the second and last part of this video. What are some of the challenges in character and virtue education? In addition to revolutionizing most of what we do in theological education, here are some of these theoretical and practical challenges alike. So here's some theoretical objections, and I will just mention these. I won't address them. Again, I do in my book. But some would argue that character education is not really higher education. Others say, well, you will never get accreditation if you do that. Some would object, saying this is intellectually weak and methodologically shallow, and we are engaged with higher forms of learning. There is a danger, and this may be a legitimate concern, as all objections, of course, are legitimate, but we need to engage with them, lest we end up not doing anything. There's a danger of being seen as cultish. There is sometimes too much reliance on secular sources, and this can be true. We do need a robust theological and biblical grounding in what we do. There can be some unrealistic expectations. I mean, to what extent can we really shape virtue in adults? And some say not really, but we do need to make a case that we can shape adults in their own character. There's an objection to paternalism, that you're actually telling people what to be. And we can object to that one as well. Some say that character and virtue education is a Western construct. As I've argued in my previous video, it is actually a global tradition, a global heritage for all humanity. And whose character, which virtue? And here, as I mentioned again in the previous video, are virtues universal for everyone? Maybe some are more contextual. So again, there's a challenge to seeing which virtues and which character we want to shape in our own particular culture and character. So there's theoretical objections. There's also some challenges that have to do with online education, and so much theological education now is taking advantage of the digital possibilities that are out there. And so the questions are, well, is it even possible with the advent of online education? Can character and virtue be done? I argue yes. Separately, not in this video, but in several places, I argue yes, character and virtue can be done, and can be done very well in an online environment. There are certainly huge advantages that can be explored. For example, students are not pulled out of their normal life situations, but they're called to develop virtue where they live. There is also the possibility of a lot of contact, of a lot of communication between students through the social media to be accountable in their virtue growth. Of course, there are also limitations to be taken on board, and as all delivery methods, it must be employed for what it can do. So online education can do things, there are other things it can't do. I also argue that relationships, which are such a key part, so the community aspect, you can develop online community because relationships are developed through language, not through physical proximity. You can be in a bus with 50 people and very, very close, but there's no relationships if no one is talking to each other. But in a way, even with a video like this, and I've not seen you, we're not in the same room, there's some sort of relationship that is being created, even if it's one way, because I'm talking to you. You're understanding who I am. And so in a way, you know me in a way that if we had sat together in a bus and not talked, you would not have known me. So language and relationships can be cultivated through online education. But this is a challenge, and we need to think this through as many other things that are happening that are new, and we need to adjust and think again. There are challenges with the assessment of character. And here there are two fundamental approaches. And again, there's more to be said about this, so I'm just mentioning it here. There's self-assessment, which is a fundamental dynamic, and we cannot wave this away too quickly. It is a fundamental aspect of character growth, the ability to self-assess. The image of James, of the man who looks at himself in a mirror and then goes away and of course doesn't do anything. Well, that is bad practice. Good practice is to self-assess and to look at your character and then to be a doer and not just a hearer of the word. So there's a fundamental dynamic. As I mentioned, it requires humility to self-assess, and also prudence, which is the virtue of discernment and wisdom, to know which virtues need to be worked on. You can't work on all of the virtues at the same time in your life. And so students need to be able to self-assess to see, okay, what areas of my life, of my character, do I need to be working on at this moment? So here we can use tools like questionnaires, reflective essays, tests, and we'll talk about that maybe in a different session. There's also external assessment. So there's self-assessment, but there's external assessment that is done by others. Now, this is important, but it's also problematic for a number of reasons, and I won't get into these in detail, but the most significant has to do with the measurement paradigm. So far, so much education has to do with numbers, with measuring, with giving a grade that can be compared, that can be put onto a grid. Now that can be useful, but it can also be very damaging and limiting, especially when it comes to formational assessment. So there's a captivity of numbers that we need to move away from. So there's different ways that we can do external assessment that don't have to do with numbers. So the easy response is that we can measure maybe the knowledge and understanding of intellectual virtues, that we can measure. But there are more difficult responses that concern some of the ideas of different ways of doing assessment, like perhaps loose success descriptors, or using assessment words rather than numbers that describe character, or using pass and fail components, combining components in a portfolio, and whatever we do. And there's different ideas, but we can think through how to do external assessment where there are other people that are actually helping students as an external voice to say, yes, your character has grown, these virtues have actually grown in your life, well done, you are on the way to changing your character, which is the work of God in your life. So, assessment. Just briefly, there are challenges also in the quality assurance of character and virtue programs. Much current accreditation is not fit for purpose of character and virtue education, so accrediting agencies need to rethink some of these things. We need to think through perhaps formal and even non-formal certification strategies. And in the ICET, in the International Council for Theological Education, and I work with the ICET, there are some very encouraging signals and signs coming from the ICET community of the global accrediting bodies that are very open to exploring ways to do quality assurance of programs that are rich and intentional in character and virtue. Another challenge is virtue literacy and illiteracy. And again, I've mentioned this, but here's just a wonderful quote. If we do not have the words, we do not have the concepts. If we do not have the concepts, we will not have a conscience. If we don't have a conscience, we will not have a practice. And if we don't have a practice, our character will never flourish. So it starts with the words. And sadly, our Christian moral language has impoverished. We speak, for example, generically about integrity, but we're not really sure what we mean. We could be more incisive by using words like truthfulness, honesty, and equity. Or we speak about servant leadership, but we miss out on the benefits of speaking specifically about leadership in terms of generosity, mercy, and humility, together with justice, courage, and prudence. So we need to redeem some of the good words that we know, and we need to learn how to describe them. So virtue illiteracy is a challenge, and we who are good with words can actually do a lot in teaching, but also in publishing, in writing, in blogging, in preaching, to bring in some of these words that have to do with virtue back into our Christian cultures. And of course, we can also think about taxonomies of virtue. How do we organize the virtues in different ways? And that's part of the virtue literacy. One of the last challenges on my list here is to find teachers of virtue. Theological educators are usually not trained in education, and that is a sad observation. And a lot is being done to actually bring the professional element of education into the practices of theological education. But there's even less, there are even fewer theological educators who are trained in character and virtue education. Normally a theological educator spends many years studying theology, and very few in education, and even less in character education. So hopefully this video and other resources that are out there, and a growing body of resources that you can engage with, will help theological educators be trained in education, and specifically in character and virtue education. And again, that was too soon for the next slide. So again, it starts with humility. And if you've watched this video and you recognize this is all new, and there's a lot of this that I'm not quite sure about, and there's words that I'm not sure what they mean, like habituation, and there's practices I've never engaged with because no one has ever shown you, then perhaps start with humility and say, okay, this is a first step. I need to do more. I need to read more. I need to research more. I need to be intentional about shaping my own ministry as a theological educator that will have robust contribution to character and virtue education. So, to conclude this video on the practice of character and virtue, here are 4 suggestions for engagement questions. Again, you're free to discuss other questions, to write about them, to think about them, to discuss them in small groups. But here are the ones that I'm suggesting. First of all, try drafting a mission statement for a theological school that gives primacy to character and virtue education. If you're working in a small group, take some time to actually write something. 1 or 2 sentences. Be as radical as you can. What would a mission statement look like for a theological school that gives primacy to character and virtue education? I'd love to see those if you actually put them together. Secondly, brainstorm about some practical things you might do with your students as you walk away from this video and go back to your students. What are some practical things you might start doing to begin educating their character and virtue? Some practical ideas have been given. Clearly you may feel you need more, but there may be some things you can actually start with, start experimenting. What might those be? Share together, do some brainstorming in your group about what you could do. Or if you're working on your own, if you're watching this video on your own, just write those down. Thirdly, what are some of the main practical obstacles to character and virtue education in your context? What are things that stand in the way? Are they structural? Do they have to do with community? Does it have to do with an online environment? Or are there assessment obstacles or accreditation obstacles or theoretical obstacles, some of those that we've seen, or maybe others? What are they? Share those together and think about those. And finally, are there practical questions that you still find unanswered? Hopefully, yes. Hopefully this video has simply given you some information, some input for more reflection, and you should have many, many questions that are unanswered. It would be good to list those. It would be good to share those together with others, so you have a sort of next steps. What can we do to move forward from here? So those are 4 suggestions for engagement questions at the end of this video on the practice of character and virtue.